Well, thank you for being here. I'm joined by a number of members of Congress, each of whom will speak, and we're going to talk about renewing faith in government and various different ways that can be done and should be done. On July 11th, I spoke at the Georgetown School of Law about how Democrats are working to renew Americans' faith in government to be on their side. As this election season has shown, Americans don't believe government can get things done. We need to change that. Then they have reason to believe that government can't get things done because the Congress itself has been dysfunctional and gridlocked. We see that as we speak right now. I outlined 4 critical steps that we ought to be taking to make Congress and the federal government more responsive, more effective, and more trusted by the American people. Those were campaign finance reform, and John Sarbanes is going to speak to that, protecting voting rights, Terry Sewell will speak to that, redistricting reform, and improving government technology. Susan DelBene is going to speak about, who is an expert on information technology, going to speak to that. This afternoon, the House will debate a bill that is part of our Renewing Faith in Government, the Modernizing Government Technology Act, which includes the bill that I introduced and is co-sponsored by Darrell Issa. It's a bipartisan bill and by others, introduced at the request of the administration, called the Information Technology Modernization Act, which would create a fund so that we could modernize as the private sector does. This legislation will help federal agencies rapidly upgrade technology systems to improve efficiency, boost cybersecurity, and save money over the long term. It will help keep Americans' private information safer and help build the foundation of a 21st century government. Today's bill would create an Information Technology Modernization Fund, which is an innovative method used by Silicon Valley to upgrade large technology systems quickly, which is clearly what we need to do in the federal government. I'm confident that the House will take a strong vote today in support of improving government technology. I've talked to the Republican leadership. I think my side will be supporting it, their side will be supporting it, and will pass very handily. This is a necessary part, in my view, of renewing America's faith in its government. But much more remains to be done. Now I would like to yield to my dear friend from Washington State, former executive in the high-tech industry, Microsoft to be particularly focused, Susan DelBene of Washington State. Susan?
Thank you, Sonny.
Oh, Susan's here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Before Congress, I had a long career in the technology sector, and I can tell you that government's use of technology can definitely be more efficient, definitely can be more flexible and more customer-centric. My district is home to some of the most innovative minds in the world, and tapping into these resources, we can help renew Americans' faith in government services. That's why I introduced legislation to extend the life of the U.S. Digital Service as a low-cost way to improve government's use of technology, save taxpayer dollars, and provide people the quality of government services that they deserve. The U.S. Digital Service was formed as a way to temporarily bring the technical know-how of industry experts to the tech-challenged federal government. But the truth is, we need more than temporary advice. Whether it's applying for student loans or signing up for Medicare Online, too often taxpayers are confronted with unfriendly and confusing user platforms. The U.S. Digital Service is working to identify, fix, and prevent large-scale technology issues within the government so that taxpayers can get a great return on the investments that they deserve. We have talented young people willing to take a break from lucrative private sector jobs because they want to improve our country, and we should not waste this opportunity. So the more our laws are forward-looking and reflective of the technological advances that have been made, the better off our economy and our government will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Next, I would like to recognize my colleague from Maryland, who probably is the single most focused and effective proponent of substantial campaign finance reform in America, clearly essential if we're going to renew Americans' faith in their government. John Sarbanes.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you, Whip Hoyer. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Mr. Hoyer for all of his various initiatives, but certainly renewing faith in America's government is critical. His Make It in America initiative, these things are all tied together. It's about whether the people out there in the country feel like they have a voice. And you can't make it in America if you can't make your voice heard in America, if you don't feel like you have respect from the government that's been stood up for you. And so all of these efforts that we're talking about today to renew faith in government, the bill that Whip Hoyer is introducing today that will be on the floor, it's all about making government work better. And there's different dimensions to that, but one of them is we've got to fix the way we fund campaigns in this country, because most Americans, as we know, looking at the polls or just based on conversations we have in the grocery store or at a town hall or in some forum, they are angry, they are cynical, they feel that their voice is not heard in Washington, is not part of government, that when we go to make our priorities in terms of public policy, we're not accounting enough for what they think and they believe. And the way you fix that is you create a new system of funding campaigns in America that puts everyday citizens at the center. So they see themselves in it, and they have confidence that when they send a representative to Washington, that person can keep working for them and doesn't get co-opted by big money and special interests. That's why campaign finance reform is so critical. The Government by the People Act, which is a proposal we've put forward to create a small donor matching system to help support campaigns in this country, would be one way of bringing the voice of everyday citizens back to Washington so they feel like they're the ones calling the shots instead of the special interests. If we do that, people will have a renewed faith in government, and they will believe that we're acting on their behalf when we make public policy. That's why this initiative is so critical, and I want to thank Mr. Hoyer for his leadership on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Now I want to introduce somebody who can speak on voting rights with great passion and knowledge. Not only is she extraordinarily able, but she was born in Selma, Alabama. Selma, of course, was the town which John Lewis and others marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to establish a great principle of our country, that in our democracy, everybody has the right to register, to vote, and to be facilitated in that voting. So from Alabama, Congresswoman Terry Sewell.
I want to thank Whip Hoyer for his leadership, not only in this vision of renewing faith in government, but also in his initiatives for Make It in America. I think it's so important that I stand with my colleagues here to talk about the integrity of our democracy. And at the very root of that integrity is the right to vote. And so I stand here really not only espousing the value of voting, but the incredible need for us to renew the trust that the American people have that their vote counts, that they have an opportunity to voice their concerns. And with the Shelby decision 3.5 years ago, the federal government no longer has preclearance, and therefore people can, many of the states that were covered under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 no longer have to have their voting practices reviewed by the Justice Department before they actually go into implementation. I think that there's no more seminal piece of legislation that this body has ever produced for civil rights than the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the fact that we stand here today on the cusp of electing a president for the first time in over 53 years, we won't have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, is truly the reason why I think voting rights and the Advancement Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would give a modern day formula of deciding how states would be considered to to offer preclearance. The Supreme Court didn't totally undermine the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What they said was that Congress needed to come up with a modern day formula to decide which states would be considered covered. And, Alabama can't be denied or penalized for what happened 60 years ago or 70 years ago. So what H.R. 2867 does, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, it provides that modern day formula. The look back is 25 years. You look at 1990 going forward and all of the pernicious voting practices that have been occurring in states for five violations or more would get them covered. And believe it or not, with looking back 1990 going forward, 5 or more statewide violations, 13 states would be considered covered. Those states not only include the state of Alabama and Mississippi, but it also includes Virginia and Arizona and California. So I think it's really important that we all acknowledge that as elected officials, we should be standing for the proposition of making it easier for people to vote, not putting up barriers. And modern day barriers such as photo ID laws, which discriminate disproportionately against African Americans, the disabled, senior citizens, and our students, is something that we should not be standing for. We should be looking to Oregon, the state of Oregon, which has automatic registration at the age of 18. We should be looking at laws that will allow it to be easier to vote. After all, your vote is your voice. And so no vote, no voice. I think that it is seminal that we stand up for everyday Americans to have the right to exercise their vote. Every American should have that right. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to call on Julia Brownley of California. California, as I think probably all of you know, had a substantial redistricting reform affected, and we believe that redistricting reform is essential for the country if we're going to renew America's faith in its government. Julia Brownley.
Thank you, Steny, and thank you for inviting me today. And certainly restoring the American people's faith in our government and our democracy is critically important. And as Steny has said, we're experiencing and have been experiencing a Congress that simply has been dysfunctional. And I think one of the root causes for this deep and intractable dysfunction goes back to how districts are drawn across our country. Partisan gerrymandering has led to more and more districts moving to the far right or to the far left instead of representing the vast majority of the American people. I think we need to change that. As a member of the Democracy Task Force, I authored legislation along with my colleagues Zoe Lofgren and Alan Lowenthal, also from California, to bring a solution to the dysfunction in Congress: citizens redistricting commissions. Today, our Redistricting Reform Act has 66 co-sponsors and continues to grow. California, Iowa, Arizona's citizen-driven redistricting processes have proved that government of, by, and for the people is not only possible, but its successes makes it imperative. Our bill will result in a more transparent election process and more accountable representation, taking back our democracy from well-funded special interests and restoring the levers of democracy to the people will not be an easy task, but making these necessary reforms is essential to the health and the well-being of our democracy. I stand ready to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to preserve our system of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Brownley. I think this personally is a critical aspect of renewing America's faith in its government. And I would hope that the Republicans' leadership would give serious attention to moving this bill as early as the lame duck session that we're probably going to have in November and December. Thank you for your leadership on this, Julia. Mr. Cardenas of California may be here. He's not here yet. He was tied up, but maybe last or next to last, but not last in terms of his abilities. A newer member of Congress, but also representing Washington State, which is one of the epicenters of high tech in our country. I'm pleased to ask Derek Kilmer to discuss the technology modernization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Derek.
I'd like to thank Whip Hoyer for spearheading a push to restore America's faith in their government and to help people make it in America. Before I came to Congress, I was a consultant for McKinsey & Company and McKinsey's high-tech practice, and also worked professionally in economic development. In those capacities, I learned that what businesses want from government is to foster an environment of trust and predictability, and I learned the transformational power of innovation. And frankly, that's why Whip Hoyer's bill to modernize government IT is so important. Government should have the ability to protect from cyber threats and drive efficiency in the provision of services and improve transparency as well as any of America's technology hubs. And there's a couple other ideas out there to do that. One, as part of our agenda, is calling for Yelpifying our government. It wasn't long ago that Mayor Ed Koch of New York would stand on the street and ask people, "How am I doing?" Technology allows us to cast a broader net and allows for more transparency. We need to bring our government fully into the 21st century because government works best when it's transparent and accountable to the people. So we're pushing the General Services Administration to work with Yelp to create unique Yelp pages for each agency or department within our government. It's time for government to use new technologies like data analytics to root out waste and to deliver services to constituents. The other thing we're working on, right now you can use your phone to check the weather or to see how bad traffic is or when the next bus is coming. And in those instances, the data you get is government data, is data from government agencies. So we've introduced a bill that would make data from the federal government more accessible, making data that should be public. And that could have a profound impact on helping to create jobs and save taxpayer money. Think about issues like the wait times at the VA and the ability to harness some of that information to drive greater efficiency. Or think about the effort by the Department of Education to develop a new college scorecard so anyone could compare schools and see which institutions provide the best bang for the buck. So our bill would create an enterprise data inventory at data.gov so individuals and organizations and other government offices would be able to find existing information from a variety of agencies and hopefully create exciting breakthroughs and new technologies. And it's a bipartisan bill to hopefully make government more effective and to make the private sector more innovative and to help citizens participate. And we've got some work to do, and I'm excited about the announcements today. Thanks, Whip Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kilmer. Campaign finance reform. Make sure that citizens are confident that it is they and not special interests who are controlling the political system in our country. Voting rights, to make sure that every American has the ability to vote, has access to the voting booth, and is facilitated in casting their vote. Redistricting reform to make sure that the districts in America are districts in which every member has to listen to all sides of the question, not just one side. These components, coupled with making sure that government technology is such that we can communicate and people can communicate with us in a better way, so that, as Derek Kilmer pointed out, we are transparent. Those are just some of the elements, 4 of the elements that we have outlined to renew Americans' faith in their government. We have seen a stark cry during this election year from Americans saying they want their government to be more trustworthy, to be more efficient, to serve them better. Questions? Yep.
Catherine Reynolds with CBS News.
Thank you, Catherine.
But with the bill that you're going to be voting on today, are there specific examples yet of how it would upgrade government technology, or is it more about establishing the fund first? And can you figure it out?
Well, I don't think you figure it out later, but certainly the funds are not in that bill. The funds were in my bill. I wish that the funds were made available now, but this is a step in authorizing that, both in a broad sense and a specific sense, to have programs which will enable agencies, and very frankly, there'll be an inventory of which are the worst systems and which are the best systems. And we will hopefully start on the worst systems. And when I say worst systems, they're the slowest, least accessible, least user-friendly for the public, and least efficient. What Silicon Valley does is they have funds, and people do it sort of on an incremental basis rather than waiting to do the entire system. I went through the IRS modernization, and it was not as successful as we want it to be. We believe this bill will facilitate it, making it easier and more efficient, and frankly, more quickly done. Thank you, Elizabeth. Anybody else?
Two questions. One, you mentioned on one of the bills, hope for the lame duck session, but can you talk about kind of the prognosis for some of these things as to whether these are things that could happen before the end of this Congress, or whether these are things that you think can only happen with more Democrats in control of Congress and in the White House? And then the second question is one of the things you didn't talk about today, but you talked about back in July that I'm interested in hearing more about, is kind of restoring earmarks and how that can help government function better, and whether there's any kind of legislative initiatives toward that end.
All right, let me speak of your first question. The prospects for legislation passing in the lame duck are not bright. I think that would be honest to say, as we have seen in the last 3 weeks, where legislation we had theoretically 4 weeks in September to legislate. 3 weeks, I think all of you would be hard pressed if I said, okay, which bills did we pass? Because they did not deal with the critical issues that confront us, voting rights being one of those.
Yes.
We have been urging since the Shelby case, Shelby versus Alabama, that we get voting rights legislation on the floor. We haven't gotten it on the floor. I believe a majority of votes are on the floor to pass it. Comprehensive immigration reform, I believe the votes are there to pass it. Redistricting reform, I will tell you frankly, in the 2010 election, Republicans took 17 states, House, Senate, and governor. I would hope that they would say, look, as I have done, because in Maryland, frankly, we've had partisan redistricting. But it would be much better for the American people, much better for the system, if we would put Julia Brownley's bill, Zoe Lofgren's bill, on the floor, with which I'm a co-sponsor. I think most of the members are co-sponsor, and have redistricting reform. It may not advantage me, it may not advantage a Republican, but it would advantage America. Now, you asked me how hopeful I am that that will happen. We're going to urge it to happen. We think it's the right thing to happen. We will see. Secondly, on earmarks, yes, I discussed at the time I gave this speech, so-called congressional, I call them congressional add-ons. The Constitution of the United States says the Congress shall have the responsibility to raise and spend money. To spend money, applying it to the priority items that confront our country. Every member of Congress comes from a district, 435 districts. Every member of Congress has an understanding of what that district needs. There were some things that were done which gave the public great concern, and they were right. So in 2007, we reformed the system. So it had to be fully transparent. If you asked for an earmark, it had to be on your website. If this committee gave you an earmark, it had to be on their website. And you could give no private sector earmarks, only public sector, so that only public objectives would be eligible for those. In that context, I think the failure to be able to do that has undermined the appropriations process because there were too many people who felt, well, maybe the general interest is served, but my district's interest is not served. And therefore, there was very little incentive to pass those bills. We find ourselves now, for the second year in a row, third year in a row, not having passed in this year any of our bills to the President of the United States. So that, yes, I think that would be a step forward. And very frankly, one of the things I'm pleased about, there have been a number of editorials which have supported that objective. Any other questions?
Congressman Horner?
Mr. McConnell, Dave McConnell, from WTOP, who we hear regularly in this
I
area.
can live up to that with my
All right.
question. Over and above what you all are talking about today and in your activities in this campaign, do you sense support for what you're trying to do, strong support among the voters, or do they seem to be distracted by what's going on between the Trump campaign and the Clinton campaign and politics?
I don't know that they're distracted. They ought to be focused on the presidential campaign. That's the most important thing happening. I think personally that the stark differences between the two candidates, the stark differences in the qualifications of the two candidates, with Mrs. Clinton by her dint of her intellect, by her character, by her temperament, and by her experience, far more able. I want the American people focused on that. Having said that, I think there is broad-based support for campaign finance reform. I think there's broad-based support for redistricting reform. I think there's broad-based support for the Voting Rights Act. And I think there's broad-based support for getting the government of the United States in a 21st century technology mode. So from that standpoint, Dave, I think the voters are certainly supportive of all four of these initiatives. But I think, rightfully, as you point out, they're focused on a campaign which has been a campaign that I think has gotten great interest and, frankly, raised great fears, and properly so. I am very hopeful that our voters will continue to focus on the qualifications and temperament and character of the two candidates, and if they do so, I'm convinced Hillary Clinton will be elected President of the United States.
Today's bill, you seem to voice confidence is going to clear. That it seems to have broad bipartisan
Yes.
support.
Yeah.
How does it look in the Senate?
I think it has broad bipartisan support in the Senate as well. Now, whether they will get to it, it's always, you may have support, but you got to get on the floor to get it passed. So we haven't crossed that threshold yet with Senator McConnell, but I am hopeful. This is a bipartisan bill, and I think I think it's going to pass overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives, and I would hope that the Senate would be able to move it either next week by unanimous consent or move it in the lame duck. But I think Senator Cornyn may have a real interest in this bill passing, and hopefully we can get it done. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.